You realized it on an ordinary night when you missed them and still didn't go back. There was no big decision attached to it. No moment where you told yourself this was the last time. You simply felt the familiar ache, thought about reaching for your phone, and then noticed that your hand never moved. The feeling stayed for a while. You stayed where you were. For a long time, leaving and staying gone had been two different things. You knew how to leave. You had done it before. You had ended conversations, stopped replying, told yourself you couldn't keep doing this. There had been nights when everything inside you felt certain that you were finished. And then the silence came. Days passed. Then weeks. Something reminded you of them. A place. A song. Their name appearing somewhere you didn't expect it. And suddenly, going back felt easier than continuing to live with their absence. So you returned. Not because everything that hurt had disappeared. You still remembered it. You remembered the waiting. The conversations that left you more confused than before. The things you had promised yourself you wouldn't accept again. But returning gave you something familiar. You knew what it felt like to wait for them. You knew how to read their silences. You knew the rhythm of hoping, being disappointed, pulling away, and finding yourself close to them again. Staying gone was different. There was nothing familiar to do with the empty space they left behind. No message to analyze. No conversation to replay. No small sign to turn into hope. There was simply a place in your day where they used to be, and for a while, that absence felt louder than everything else. Maybe that's why the hardest nights weren't always the ones when you remembered what happened. Sometimes they were the ordinary ones. The evenings when nothing was wrong, but you suddenly wanted to hear their voice. The mornings when you wondered whether they had thought about you. The moments when you almost checked something you had stopped checking. Those were the moments no one saw. From the outside, nothing happened. A phone stayed on the table. A message wasn't sent. You drove home without taking the road that passed their street. You went to sleep without checking whether their name had appeared on your screen. Nothing dramatic happened. But you remembered how differently those moments used to end. There was a time when missing them was enough to send you back. You didn't need a good reason. One lonely evening could do it. One memory could soften everything that had once felt clear. One message from them could make weeks of distance disappear in minutes. Even silence could bring you back, because sometimes not knowing what they were thinking felt harder than returning and finding out. This time, the silence remained unanswered. The days kept passing. You began noticing it in small places. Your phone wasn't the first thing you checked in the morning anymore. Sometimes hours passed before you remembered that there had once been someone whose reply could shape your entire day. Their absence hadn't disappeared. It just wasn't standing in the center of everything. Then there were the places. A street you used to avoid appeared ahead of you one afternoon. For a moment, the street felt familiar. The feeling came a little later. You remembered where you used to turn, where you waited, which window you looked toward. But you didn't change your route. You didn't slow down. You kept driving. So the memory came with you for a few minutes, and then became quieter somewhere behind you. The street stayed where it had always been. You simply weren't waiting there anymore. And then, perhaps, their name appeared on your phone again. The message you once imagined receiving. The one you had rehearsed answers to without admitting you were still waiting for it. There it was. For a moment, the old familiarity returned. You knew exactly what the version of you from before would have done. She would have read it again. Then, once more. She would have wondered why they wrote now, what they meant, whether something had changed. She might have answered before she even knew what she wanted to say. But this time, you read the message and put the phone down. Not to punish them. Not because you wanted them to wonder where you were. Not because you suddenly felt nothing. Their message simply didn't open the same place inside you anymore. That may have been the strangest part. You had imagined that not going back would feel powerful. Instead, it felt almost ordinary. There was no rush of certainty, no feeling of winning, just a quiet evening continuing around you after their name disappeared from the screen. You made something to eat. You watched the room grow darker. You thought about them once or twice, and the night continued. Maybe you even missed them. That hadn't disappeared completely either. There were still nights when the memory felt closer. when loneliness made the past look softer around the edges, when you remembered the good parts before remembering why you left. On those nights, the old conversation was still there on your phone. Their number hadn't become impossible to find. Nothing outside you was physically stopping you from returning. You simply didn't. And missing them had to remain what it was, a feeling, not a direction. It rose, it stayed. Eventually it became quieter. You didn't have to turn it into contact for it to pass. That was different. Before, every feeling seemed to require an action. Missing them meant reaching out. Confusion meant asking another question. Silence meant checking. Loneliness meant wondering whether going back might hurt less this time. Now, some feelings simply moved through an evening without changing what happened next. You could remember them without entering their life again. You could wonder how they were without finding out. You could feel the old tenderness without using it as a reason to reopen something that had already become quiet. There was still no single day when you became someone who didn't return. That day never really came. Instead, there were many small days. A Monday when you didn't check, a night when you didn't write, a drive when you kept going, a message that stayed unanswered, a memory that remained only a memory. None of them seemed important enough to mark, but eventually, there were enough of them behind you that you noticed the distance. This time, you hadn't gone back. And the realization didn't feel the way you once imagined it would. It wasn't relief without sadness. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't the absence of every old feeling. There were still pieces of the relationship inside your memory. Certain places still belonged partly to that time. Certain songs still carried a voice you hadn't heard in a while. Some nights could still make you wonder what would happen if you reached out. But wondering wasn't the same as returning. Missing wasn't the same as going back. Remembering wasn't the same as reopening. That difference had become quieter and clearer without you forcing it to. Maybe that's what you noticed most. There was less movement now, less reaching, less checking, less circling back toward the same place whenever the absence became uncomfortable. The space between you and them was no longer something you had to constantly manage. It simply existed. And somewhere inside that space, your days had continued. Not perfectly. Not without memories. Just without returning. Tonight might still hold one of those memories. Their name may still cross your mind before you fall asleep. For a few seconds, you remember how it felt. Going back seemed easier then. Staying away felt harder. But the phone can remain where it is. The night can remain quiet. And the memory can remain a memory. You are still here. They are still somewhere behind you. And nothing has to move tonight.